droning, noise, and ambience. Each of these a vital tool in developing the proper atmosphere for something to be haunting. There's something to be said about just how much music can impact our perception of things. With the right backing track and delivery, even a simple little phrase like, "It's just a joke," can come across as much more menacing than any single threat. And for that matter, sound design sits in this realm as well. When you take something as simple and overlooked in our lives as, well, the sound of our footsteps and the ambience of the environment around us, and twist it just a little bit, it can make all the difference in the world, turning something as simple as our walking into a strange and otherworldly experience. Video games have always been a special medium because, unlike all the others except for maybe film, it's a medium that uses elements from every other artistic avenue, creating a wholly new form of art. But where it elevates itself above film is in how it even recycles that medium to tell its own stories and present its own unique experience. Or rather than watch, we get to play. Video games combine literary storytelling with art and graphic design, animation, acting and filmography, and music to create unique and unified experiences. The very best of them balance all these aspects to create something full and cohesive, where each area shines in its own right, in order to propel the experience to the best and most immersive that it can be. But even in that, there are elements that remain the focal points, such as gameplay and graphics, both of which are responsible for defining the game in its tone and style, setting it apart from everything else, as well as giving us a basis that allows it to sit within a respective genre. Now, add the obvious stories to this list, and these are the three main aspects that people give their most attention to when playing games. But there is another one that I actually think is more important than a few of the others, and that element is music. Video game music itself is so important and beloved that in many cases it's actually inseparable from the success of quite a few series. Just look at the music of, well, the Doom remake of 2016 and its follow-up. Much of that fun, adrenaline-pumping gameplay would not work or be nearly as satisfying without Mick Gordon's fantastic soundtrack. And I don't even think I need to bring up Jet Set Radio or Bomb Rush Cypherpunk, its modern iteration, because these games are completely brought to life by their funky, experimental, and energetic soundtracks, really culminating in the worlds feeling as vibrant as they look. This is actually a topic that I've covered in a previous video of mine, specifically with the Sonic franchise. The music for that series is inseparable because much of the charm and soul of Sonic comes from its soundtracks, and I think it's safe to say that both the adventure games wouldn't nearly be the classics they are today without their extremely fun and interesting soundtrack music, as well as the licensed work from Crush 40. It's almost impossible to imagine Sonic without those sorts of sounds behind him, but that's a bit more of an obvious one. So why don't we talk about Minecraft? It's impossible, at least for me, to imagine exploring the grassy plains or delving deep into the mines without the beautiful work of C418's music. The atmospheres and the vibrancy it creates in the environment really brings the world of Minecraft to life. And without that iconic music, without Sweden playing in the background during a sunrise, Would Minecraft still feel like Minecraft? I'd argue that it wouldn't. But that's essentially the basis of countless games and countless genres. And you know, I can't really think of a genre that exemplifies this phenomena more than survival horror. Survival horror is a genre both beloved and remembered because not only is it an encapsulation of a specific era, but it's a style of horror that you can't get anywhere else. There's really nothing quite like it. Even if we were to look at other types of horror in video games, like Amnesia or Outlast, which might be great and amazing in their own right, but they still lack the same atmosphere and horror of survival horror. They're in a completely different realm. And while that comes down to a difference in gameplay, much of it's also due to the music and the sound design. Survival horror is extremely reliant on its use of sound design and sound tracking to achieve its unique and special feeling, an atmosphere that really encapsulates a single genre that nothing else really can. It's why when people discuss the best video game soundtracks of all time, you'll constantly see a plethora of Silent Hill games on that list, maybe even some of the Resident Evil titles like Resi 2, or even hidden gems like Haunting Ground tend to get a mention. And begs the question, what makes these soundtracks so special? What is it specifically about survival horror music that separates it from the rest of the pack? And well, the answer is pretty simple. Survival horror music soundtracks terror. It's a style that you feel more than you hear, and music that's so ingrained in its characters and atmosphere that it defines them. And in its absence, these games lose so much of their identity and character. Now, I know that's a little bit of a loaded answer, but that is what I want to get into here. I want to talk about what makes these specific soundtracks so special, what makes them work. So, why don't we take a journey? Let's talk about how we can soundtrack terror, and just why survival horror music sounded like that.
Was I dreaming?
How do you feel?
Oh, like I've been run over by a truck. But I'm alright, I guess.
Glad to hear it. You from around here? Why don't you tell me what happened?
Wait a second, I'm just a tourist.
Now, to understand the music, we do need to have an understanding of its source, because survival horror in and of itself is a bit of an odd duck in the gaming world, because it's a style and genre that is very different in its construction and its motivations than most other games are. While these days we have a lot of variety in terms of what games go for in terms of tone and intention, back during the 5th and 6th generation when survival horror was the big genre that it was, most games really stuck to trying to be outright fun and joyous experiences. Games like Katamari, Klonoa, and even Mario. The general design philosophy between these games was to create, again, a joyous and fun experience, and all of them were relatively lighthearted and enjoyable to really anyone. The challenge came from the gameplay, not really story, except for, I guess maybe Klonoa with some of its more psychological and emotional elements. And even on the more violent, action-oriented end of the spectrum, games still stayed within this more happy and joyous end, if you want to call them that, albeit in a different form. Games like Halo and Gears of War or Call of Duty are all series that are still traditionally fun and adrenaline pumping, but their challenge is different. They're not really wonder and whimsy type games like the previous examples, But they're more so the, like I said, power fantasies of overcoming tons of enemies and unbeatable odds to secure victory and feel like a powerful killing machine. Survival horror, on the other hand, is completely divorced from these two. These are games that aren't meant to be fun in the traditional sense. They're not meant to be a joy or fun experience. Rather, survival horror wants to make you feel isolated and alone. It wants you to feel anxious and afraid. A good modern parallel to what survival horror was trying to create back in the day would be the modern Soulsborne genre of games. Titles like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, where these are not games that are fun or joyous to play in any sense of the word. Rather, these are games about frustration, triumph, and tribulation, where you get your ass handed to you and you get slaughtered by everything until after tons and tons of tries, you finally figure out the perfect patterns, the perfect strategies, and overcome the challenges and frustration to finally progress further. These are what I like to refer to as mountain climbing games, where the act of climbing the mountain is a tedious and rough venture, but the overwhelming feeling of accomplishment when you finally make it to the peak of the mountain makes all the struggle feel like it was worth it, giving you that rush of serotonin that makes everything worth the struggle. Survival horror is different, obviously, from this, but back in the day, it categorized itself in a similar way by having that same sort of challenge and frustration to it. Aside from some of the later games like Resident Evil 4, which were more combat-centric, in survival horror, it was the opposite. Combat was not a battle that you could win, it was a battle to survive. You didn't win, you escaped. Every bullet counted. Every healing item was a decisive choice on whether you use it now and risk needing it later, or save it for later because you never know what's behind the next door. And it was elements like this that would help to really separate survival horror from its peers, even among other games that touted themselves as horror experiences. It was rare for survival horror games to really be all about shock and awe. You did have examples of that, like Dino Crisis, but for the most part, many of these games were actually more old school in their construction. Rather than being the jump scare simulators of Amnesia and Outlast, where it's constant running around in the dark, afraid of the gruesome and gory fate that will fall upon you if you lose, survival horror was more interested in the old school and taking elements of classic Gothic literature and using slow-paced tension and dread to terrorize the player. The fear wasn't of the monster popping out of the dark. The fear was, the monster is out of sight. And that expectation and tension of knowing that danger is here, danger is everywhere, but you don't know when it's going to strike, is where a lot of the initial fear of the genre comes from. And while that might sound silly when you think of the granddaddy of survival horror, Resident Evil, the reality is like many others in the genre, that over-the-top and kind of stupid original game with its schlocky sci-fi horror crap was still a game built completely on subtlety and tension. Yeah, you're going to encounter more combat and more wacky sci-fi enemies than you would in maybe some of the other games, but the fear still came from the dread of the situation more than it ever came directly from the monsters. Now add on to this the use of fixed camera angles, which was a necessity for the control schemes of the time, and you would have the key elements of survival horror: subtlety, tension, resource management, and fixed camera angles, creating even more psychological tension. Now, to tie this all together so we can get on to the main topic here, what I'm trying to hit at is that survival horror was a genre built up less on action and less on constant blood-pumping shock and awe, and was more so a style of game that sat in the subtle, slow, and uncertain end of the spectrum, where atmosphere reigned supreme and every aspect of the games would play into this over-enveloping feeling and atmosphere. So, making music for a genre like this wouldn't be as easy as making some creepy sounding music and just sticking it in the background. Because in that case, we would have something that is familiar. We would have something that gives us a constant and takes away from the dread and confusion that we feel. So if you were going to soundtrack these games and keep their terror alive, you would need to find a style of music to lean into that, instead of distracting the player or giving them a constant, would actually play directly into the atmosphere and help tie all these different elements together in order to make them work congruently. And there was really only one style of music that would be able to achieve this sort of thing, and that would be ambient music. Most of the music that you'll hear in survival horror games is going to fall under the umbrella of ambient music, which, just from its Wikipedia page alone, should give you an idea of just how varied and complicated this relatively simple genre of music can be. And that's because it's not really a genre in the traditional sense. When it comes to, I guess, more traditional forms of music, you can kind of define most genres around not just its bass sound, but even simply by describing the types of instruments that are used to make it, the techniques that are used to play them, and the type of sounds associated with it. For example, if I were to say 4 members, being one guitar player, one singer, one bass player, and a drummer, you're probably going to guess some form of rock or blues music. And if I were to describe maybe the use of high-gain guitars and some screaming, you'd probably guess some flavor of punk or post-hardcore. And with most music, that's kind of how you can boil them down. But with ambient music, it's a little different. Ambient music is just that. It's ambience. The genre has a long and winding story, but for the sake of brevity here, the best way to understand what ambient music is through a quote from the legendary Brian Eno, who famously described ambient music as being something that must be as ignorable as it is interesting. While normally when someone describes a style of music as a vibe or a feeling, it just means that they don't really know how to properly define what they're talking about. But in the case of ambient, that's actually what it's supposed to be. A vibe and a feeling. Music that doesn't bring enough attention to it for you to really outright notice it, but also isn't so boring and unnoteworthy that it just fades off into the distance completely. One of the best examples of ambient music, at least in a more commercial sense, would be Aphex Twin's second record, Selected Ambient Works 2. Mostly known today for his contributions to IDM and drum and bass, Aphex Twin was also a major pioneer in ambient music. What you're currently hearing in the background is a pitched and modified version of one of his songs, and that's just so I don't get flagged for it. The music itself is droning, and even in its drone, it's a very subtle track. You notice it, but not entirely. And if I were to let it play, you'd eventually drift off into thought. And that's because this is a song that succeeds in what Brian Eno said. But with it, the track also brings a specific feeling, a specific ambience. It paints the tone of your thoughts. It's currently painting the tone of this video. It creates a feeling that immerses you. And This is the very technique that survival horror soundtracks use to immerse you in their worlds. The music that you hear in these games is much less lush and peaceful. Instead, it's ominous, a droning darkness, and a catalyst for unease. In the emptiness and isolation of the environments that we're trapped in, the music we hear is filling in for the lack of imminent danger. Instead, it's sitting beneath our dread, under our consciousness of the environment. But it never fully disappears. It always sits just far enough to still build that tension. We might be alone, and in a sense, we might be safe. But the music behind us is reminding us that we are never safe. And when it disappears, or worse, when it changes, it subtly reinforces the change in the environment and the change in our situation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call atmosphere. A big part of survival horror is its use of atmosphere. Most of the classics are well known for their soundtracks, but outside of some key cutscene music, some theme songs, or other specific parts of the experience, the bulk of most survival horror games' music is pretty formless. As we talked about with the ambient section, it all lives in this ghostly and somber form. There's always a distinct airiness in the soundtracks of these games. A consistent score that's almost always there, rarely leaving you in complete silence, but most times the music is something that you feel rather than you hear. You only really notice it when it first appears to begin with, and when it changes or just fades away completely. The reason behind this is because depending on the ambience, the mood could be extremely different. Sound is one of the most important tools in any medium because no matter what the visuals are, the music will do a lot of heavy lifting in giving the audience a cue on how to feel in that current moment. Now, why don't we look at a few examples to really understand this? For a direct comparison that doesn't lean on pure ambience, and instead includes a little bit of melody, we can take a look at one of survival horror's great granddaddies, Clock Tower. Now, this title isn't really a full-on survival horror game, and exists in the weird realm that Sweet Home does, where it's a predecessor that helped build a lot of the bases that you would see used later on in the genre. And with its music, it does just that. Clock Tower has a very cheesy 80s horror premise. It's essentially a game where you play as the victim in a slasher movie, and for the most part, the entire experience is silent outside of some diegetic sounds like our footsteps and doors opening and closing, but we do get some occasional ambience here and there. But where the example comes in is whenever Scissor Man appears. He'll jump out, and then this music will start to play. The Clock Tower theme is one of the most effective in portraying the horror and adrenaline that you are meant to feel. It's a simple ambience with a thumping bass, and these occasional atmospheric chirps popping in and out of the track every few bars. The song instantly announces itself, and creates a fear response from its dark tone and melody, having this distinctly evil sound to it. But the bass and those chirpy synth hits give the music a boost of energy, a sonic adrenaline that indicates that this isn't the end, this isn't game over as long as we run and escape. The whole thing is incredibly effective and evocative, giving the game both a score as well as serving as a guide for the player's emotions and reactions. It's brilliant and shows just how integral a simple piece of background music can be. Now, to give an example, let's replace it with some generic action movie music instead. Yeah, it just kind of falls apart and sounds absolutely generic, losing its tone and atmosphere completely. But that's how important music can be. But this example isn't exactly the best because this is one that still has use of melody. And like I said, a lot of these games work without it. So how about we have another and more recent example? Let's take a look at the intro of Silent Hill 2. Here the music is breathing. It's heavy yet intangible. There's a faint melody buried within the waves of sound, changing in pitch, as if it's trying to mimic a chord progression. But it's never clear enough to fully feel like a tangible song. Rather, it's just a haunting ambience, reflecting the intangible dread and stress of our player character as he ponders his position. Like much of the work of Akira Yamaoka, the music here is top class. It's the cream of the crop, and that's because above any of the other composers of survival horror, no one quite hits the nail on the head like Akira does. His music always breathes, it feels alive and organic, allowing for that airy and haunting element to feel all the more ghostly and liminal, making his music feel like it teeters on the edge of the uncanny valley. Now, let's change the music for this scene. Let's throw in some contemporary trip hop, since that's the type of music associated with Silent Hill, and see how it works. While this track doesn't even not fit, it doesn't sound bad, it completely changes the scene. The tone, the movements, the aesthetics, and even James's facial expressions, they all feel like they mean something different. A lot of that haunting atmosphere is gone, and now it feels more like a movie like Fight Club or something. And that's because we no longer have the original ambience there to guide our emotions and to guide our reactions to what's happening on screen. Now, to give just one more example, because one, I think it's funny to ruin these scenes with these unfitting songs, but also because it cuts to the core of the issues, we have Resident Evil 1's basement theme. After going through quite a bit of terrifying situations throughout the game and facing off with plenty of monsters, we eventually reach a point where we have to descend into the Spencer Mansion's basement. And after all we've been through, we know that there's nothing down there that's going to be good. And once we start making it down that ladder, the game's music perfectly reflects that. As we descend, we're greeted with foreboding ambience and noisy stabs. Music that feels punchy and heavy, like we're in imminent danger. And the stabs of the music serve as a bit of a pulse, like a jolt of energy and danger, all while the background remains this creeping, lingering, holding notes. The whole thing just makes us sit and feel the terror and the dread of the entire situation at hand. And it's perfect. Now, to make the example, I don't even have to do the honors of ruining this scene with any unfitting music, because back in 1996 with the DualShock edition, Capcom already did so. Yeah, this is horrifying in a way that I don't think the developers ever intended. And the story behind this one is a bit wild to begin with. Because, Capcom hired an up-and-coming composer who claimed to have a deafening hearing condition, and years after destroying the soundtrack to this game, he would end up getting caught and admit to exaggerating just how bad his hearing condition was, but it actually didn't matter because he had a ghostwriter do the soundtrack for this game, and the whole story is a fucking mess. But if there was anything that composer Takashi Niigaki proved, it was just how pivotal and important music is to creating the atmosphere and tension in these games. And if you simply swap a song, a horrifying and foreboding moment can then just turn to a complete and utter joke that's still being laughed at nearly 30 years later. But I guess that's another aspect that's inadvertently been shown off by the Resident Evil example. Intentional direction, and just how pivotal it is to make everything work. Now, I'm not going to say that other genres of games don't have intentionality to their music, but the 5th and 6th generation was still before and kind of at the beginning of when a lot of games would slowly begin to use more film score techniques to soundtrack their games. During these generations, it was still when most games' music was just there to fill a void and work as traditional background music in, a basic sort of way. To refer back to Klonoa, you're not going to hear music in that game that really tells a big story. You'll have some standout tracks here and there, but for the most part, the music in that game just fills the silence and gives a vague emotional resonance to paint the environment and the situation. And this is something that you can see in a more serious game like even Metal Gear, where the music is less of a backdrop in the same way that Klonoa is. It's not just there to bring to life your cool platforming action, and instead serves in more of a traditional soundtrack film score sort of way. The commonality between both these soundtracks is not really their seriousness or less seriousness in the storytelling aspect, and more so it's just that this is just music, and it's just here to act in a traditional backdrop and score sort of way. And this is where survival horror begins to separate itself in how it uses its music. Because with survival horror, the music is there for more than just a theme and background. It has a greater intention, and that intention is to communicate with the player. Let's take the save room from Resident Evil for example here. The music is different from just about everywhere else in the game. It's serene and pretty. It's calm and almost peaceful while still maintaining a certain melancholy to it. The music almost everywhere else in the game is varying levels of tense. Whether it's the creeping dread of the mansion's halls or the pressing terror of the basement, the save room completely contrasts with it. And that's because it has a specific intention to communicate something to you. And that's that the music is communicating that you are safe here. This is a place of rest and refuge. This is a place where you won't be attacked, where you have the ability to find respite. And it works in the same way that the music does in dangerous areas, where the music becomes foreboding and communicates to us that we aren't safe in this place, and that there is danger lurking in the darkness ahead. Essentially, in survival horror games, music is used less as just a backdrop or a score, and more so like a tool, one that's meant to communicate with the player, and not just immerse them in the world, but also to guide them, to reflect present dangers or the lack thereof in the environment. Or, like I said, to use a lot more intentionality with its sound. But that's the other thing. Where this all gets even more interesting is when you have franchises like Fatal Frame that take this concept and weaponize it. For those of you who haven't played these games, the Fatal Frame series from the PS2 is some of the scariest that I've ever got my hands on. And much of that is due to how they all seem to weaponize their atmosphere. Unlike most games in the genre, Fatal Frame only seldom uses its music to clearly communicate with the player. Instead, it likes to keep you immersed in its uncomfortable and breathy ambience, while the camera angles that it presents to you only get more voyeuristic. It takes the normal communication, that normal back and forth that we see from titles like Resident Evil or Dino Crisis, and instead keeps it on a constant dial tone. We are always waiting for an answer back from the atmosphere of the game. And that's where a lot of the suspense comes from, and it's also why a lot of the suspense never really subsides. It only does so when it's finally broken. And when it finally does communicate to us, it communicates pure terror, as that little bit of safety that we didn't even feel like we truly had is invaded by the ghosts around us. This is what I mean by intentional direction. All of this is predicated on the music creating and directing the atmosphere and having a constant yet unspoken conversation with the player, communicating what's happening, communicating what feeling we are meant to have, and in a lot of times, even lying to us and misdirecting us in order to elevate the horror at hand. Now, as interesting as all of this is just the intentional design part of it all. This is just an explanation of how the music works and what its intention is, what it's trying to do. If we really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of why survival horror music has such a unique sound, we're going to need to go a little bit deeper, because we need to understand just how this kind of music was made and how these games were scored. And in order to do so, we're going to need to talk about sampling. A big reason much of not just survival horror, but video game music in general sounded the way it did during the 5th and 6th generation was mostly due to the heavy use of sampling, and more specifically, the heavy use of sample CDs. Back during the 90s and the early 2000s, it was really common for producers and composers to really rely on sample CDs. And for those of you who don't understand this concept, because it's kind of an old one at this point, you could imagine them as essentially the physical version of a digital sample pack that you'd buy off a place like Splice today. These were extremely common with composers, especially with survival horror composers. Some of the more popular names that you've probably heard before would be some of the discs like Bizarre Guitars, Distorted Reality, and Zero Gravity, but there are plenty more beyond just these three. Some of these packs would focus specifically on drums, while others would have more atmospheric and ambient sounds to them, and you'd even have some that were specifically sound effects. It's why when you play a lot of old games, you'll hear a lot of the same sound effects and even some of the same melodies between soundtracks. As varied as you can make them sound, some composers would be a little lazy about it. Now, what really makes them special in the use of survival horror is because a common theme across most of these sample CDs is that when you listen to the samples contained on them, most of them carry a really odd and inhuman quality to them, like this. And the more that you dig into these sample CDs, the more that you're going to find some of the original samples used to make some of the iconic songs you hear across many of these games. This one specifically was used in Silent Hill. Now, I know hearing that may take some of the magic out of the music for some of you, because you're probably stupid and think that because it samples, none of these composers are actually responsible for the music. So let me just kind of qualm that right now. If we simply take a bunch of samples from these packs and throw them together like this, you get an ugly, formless mess of noise. Now, if we actually modify them, pitch them, and compose them, and add our own instrumentation on top of it, an actual song. The reason I'm pointing this out isn't just to say that these composers like Akira were using sample packs, but more specifically, it was the design mentality around making the music with them. Because of the limited capabilities of samplers at the time and our limited ability to really modify them into something completely different, the techniques that they would use in creating chord progressions by simply pitching the samples up and down to create a faux chord progression is where a lot of that uncanniness and weird plasticky nature of the music would come from. Add on to this the need to modify the sample by stretching it and pitching it, putting reverb and distortion on them to get different sounds, and it would all culminate in making everything feel and sound much more uncanny and artificial. And while this might not have been the intention of every composer, for those like the aforementioned Akira Yamaoka, it would give them an even greater ability to craft music that feels inhuman and otherworldly, like this. It's a very different kind of evocative. It's a very different kind of melancholic and emotional. Because while we can still get that feeling from it, we can still hear that sound from this music, there's always that quality of uncanniness, that plasticky and artificial noise that comes with it, that paints the sound, and in a lot of ways is what's responsible for the music itself feeling as uncomfortable as it does when played in the games themselves. So if we were to culminate all these various aspects from the design philosophy of the soundtracks of these games and how the music is produced and what it's used for, and we add on these technical limitations and the production of them, it all really culminates into that iconic old school survival horror sound. it really lives up to the idea of soundtracking terror. Because as H.P. Lovecraft once said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." And what better to encapsulate that feeling than music that is unworldly? Music that feels and sounds like the unknown. And if that's how your music sounds, then that is how you soundtrack terror. Now, before we completely close out for the day, this is my wall of shame. The list of names who keep the lights on and pay me at least once a month to make sure that I come back and make more videos. Now, I can't say how grateful I am. All sarcasm aside, I'm very grateful, and I'm very excited that we're finally, I believe we've hit 50K by the time this comes out, and if we haven't, we're right around the corner. We'll hit it within a few hours of this video being out. But I can't thank you guys enough. I'm going to be doing a 50K Q&A sort of video. It's going to be lighthearted and just kind of answering a lot of your guys' questions and going in depth on some of them. And with some of the ones I've gotten so far, they might be a little silly, but you can look forward to that. And I have a whole bunch of other projects. If you're subscribed to the Patreon, then you already know a handful of them. I got a big one coming out in the fall regarding a certain nearly 20-year-old post-apocalyptic RPG, which I'm very excited to be talking about, but alas, we'll get to that when we get to that. Thank you guys for everything. Thank you guys for 50K, and I hope you guys continue to watch. I love entertaining you, and I hope to do so for a very long time. But with that, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, donate to me on Patreon, you know you want to, and I'll see you in the next video.